Have you ever wondered how a global superpower, at the absolute peak of its wealth and democratic pride, could willingly trade its freedom for the illusion of security? Hey, welcome back to the channel. If you are just joining us, this video is part of a complete playlist tracking the rise, the rot, and the final collapse of Rome. If you didn't watch part 1 yet, do yourself a favor. Pause this video right now, click the playlist link in the description and go watch that first. Part 1 sets up the blueprint of how Rome built its wealth, its architectural dominance, and the silent societal cracks that started it all. If you're already caught up, welcome to the dark heart of our story. Today, in Part 2, we are stepping into a dangerous turning point in human history, the exact moment a free republic willingly traded its liberty for security. We are talking about private armies marching on their own capital, the ultimate political flex of Julius Caesar, a bloody assassination that completely backfired, and a terrifying political lie that birthed the first official god-king of Rome. This is a psychological autopsy of how a democracy dies from the inside out. To understand how the republic shattered, you have to understand the weapon that built it, an army of citizen soldiers. For centuries, Roman legionaries weren't mercenaries fighting for a quick paycheck. They were farmers and landowners who had a physical stake in the country. They put down their plows, picked up their shields, and marched into battle for an abstract, sacred idea: Rome. When the war was over, they surrendered their weapons and went back to their fields. There was an entire cultural mythology built around figures like Cincinnatus, a leader who was given absolute dictatorial power to win a desperate war, and who immediately resigned that power 15 days later to return to his simple farm. That was the old Roman character, an identity forged in civic duty. But as the empire grew wealthy from foreign conquests, the system began to cannibalize itself. Staggering wealth and millions of slaves flooded into the Italian peninsula. Rich political elites in the Senate started using this endless capital to buy up vast swathes of bankrupt agricultural land, creating massive corporate estates worked entirely by enslaved labor. When the citizen soldiers returned home from years of brutal warfare, they found their small family farms ruined by neglect and their livelihoods stolen. They couldn't compete with free slave labor. Forced to sell their ancestral lands for pennies, they migrated into the crowded slums of the capital, becoming a landless, jobless urban underclass, utterly abandoned by a government detached from its people. And that is the exact moment the psychological contract between the population and the state broke forever. When citizens realized that fighting for the system no longer guarantees a future for their children, they stop believing in the system. They stop respecting the laws, and they start looking for a savior. The streets of Rome were packed with hundreds of thousands of angry, desperate men who had military training, knew how to kill, and had absolutely nothing left to lose. Enter powerful, fiercely ambitious generals like Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, who saw an opportunity to rewrite the rules of ultimate power. Marius realized that Rome's military was running out of soldiers because the old laws required recruits to own property. In a series of sweeping reforms, Marius threw out the old constitution. He declared that you no longer needed to own property to join the legions. He opened the ranks to the poorest classes, and instead of the state providing your armor and weapons, your commanding general would. Overnight, the core psychology of the Roman military flipped. Soldiers stopped fighting for a patriotic ideal and started fighting for the individual billionaire general who paid their salary and promised them a retirement package of land in the provinces. The legions became the private, armed employees of ambitious politicians. The sword of Rome was officially sold to the highest bidder. The soldiers knew that if their general succeeded in politics, they would get rich. If their general failed, they would starve. It didn't take long for these warlords to realize the terrifying potential of this new reality. If your army answers only to your personal wallet, you don't have to beg the corrupt politicians in the Senate for laws or power anymore. You can just go take whatever you want by force. The ultimate breaking point arrived with a general named Sulla. Locked in a bitter political dispute with rivals in the capital, Sulla found himself stripped of his military command by the Senate. But Sulla had a private army that loved him and hated the politicians. He stood before his legions and explained that the Senate was trying to steal their glory and financial future. Sulla did something that was considered completely unthinkable, breaking a 400-year-old taboo. He turned his veteran legions around and marched his army across the Pomerium, the sacred, legal boundary of Rome. Sulla's soldiers invaded their own city, fighting in the streets and hunting down politicians. Sulla used his private army to execute his political enemies, creating the infamous proscription lists, literal death warrants posted in the Forum every morning. Anyone who brought in a listed head received a cash reward. Sulla established himself as an absolute dictator, proving a fatal point to every ambitious youth watching from the shadows. The laws of a democracy mean absolutely nothing if you possess enough men with swords who are loyal to your bank account rather than your constitution. Sulla eventually stepped down, but the damage was done. The guardrails were smashed, and the Republic was on life support. Out of the chaos rose the most brilliant, dangerous political mastermind the ancient world had ever produced, Julius Caesar. Caesar understood the new rules of Rome better than anyone. He knew that ultimate survival required two things: the fanatical devotion of an unbeatable army and the emotional love of the common people. He secured a military command in the brutal wilderness of Gaul, modern-day France. For nearly a decade, Caesar campaigned across the forests, conquering vast territories and transforming his legions into an elite, fiercely loyal war machine. He slept in the dirt with his men, marched on foot beside them through winter blizzards, and knew his centurions by name. But Caesar was also a master of public relations. During his campaigns, he wrote fast-paced, action-packed reports of his victories, written in clean, accessible prose, and sent them back to the capital. These reports, known as the Gallic Wars, were read aloud in the crowded public squares of Rome. He made sure every poor citizen viewed him not just as a distant politician, but as a legendary folk hero who was expanding the glory of Rome while the Senate sat in luxury doing nothing. He used the immense plunder of Gaul to fund massive public games, build new marketplaces, and bribe officials, buying the loyalty of the Roman street from hundreds of miles away. By the time his campaigns were finished, the aristocratic elites in the Senate were paralyzed with fear. Led by conservative hardliners like Cato and Caesar's former ally Pompey the Great, the Senate decided to crush him. They sent him an ultimatum: disband your army immediately, resign your command, and return to Rome as a defenseless private citizen to stand trial for alleged political crimes. It was a perfectly designed trap. If Caesar obeyed, his immunity would be gone, and his political enemies would use corrupt courts to strip his wealth and send him into exile. If he refused, he would be branded a traitor. The Senate believed they had trapped the tiger. On the cold night of January 10th, 49 BC, Caesar reached the banks of the Rubicon. This shallow river was the official northern administrative boundary of Italy. By Roman law, crossing this river with a standing army was the ultimate act of high treason, an irreversible declaration of war against the Republic. If his boots touched the water on the southern bank with weapons drawn, there was no turning back. Standing on that foggy bank, Caesar weighed the fate of Western civilization. He looked at his veteran soldiers, turned to his inner circle, and muttered three words that still echo through history: Alia iacta est, the die is cast. He plunged his horse into the water and his army followed. With that single step, Caesar didn't just break a law, he shattered the grand illusion of the Republic. He looked at the entire entrenched political establishment of Rome and said, "Let them try to stop me." Caesar's march on Rome was a blitzkrieg. Panic gripped the capital. Pompey and the majority of the senators were so terrified that they abandoned the city without a fight, fleeing across the sea to Greece to assemble an army. Caesar entered Rome without shedding citizen blood, took control of the treasury, and began hunting his rivals. For the next 4 years, Caesar fought a global civil war, chasing his enemies from Spain to Greece, Egypt, and North Africa. He crushed every army the Senate could assemble, proving his tactical genius was completely unmatched. When he returned to Rome, he was the undisputed master of the Roman world. The terrified Senate showered him with unprecedented honors, giving him the right to wear purple triumphal robes permanently, naming a month after him July, and eventually declaring him Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. He bypassed traditional legislative channels entirely to pass sweeping reforms, redistributing land to veterans, reforming the calendar, relieving consumer debts, and granting citizenship to conquered peoples. For the traditional Roman senators, this was a living nightmare. They watched a single, charismatic celebrity tear down 4 centuries of democratic checks and balances in a matter of months. When Caesar sat on his golden chair in the Forum, receiving delegations without even bothering to stand up, the senators saw a tyrant who viewed himself as a god. To men who traced their ancestry back to the heroes who overthrew the original kings of Rome, this was the ultimate betrayal. They convinced themselves that the problem wasn't the system, it was just this one man. A secret network of conspirators, calling themselves the Liberators and led by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius, reached a desperate conclusion. The only way to save liberty was to cut out the heart of the dictator. Caesar had treated Brutus like a son, pardoning him after the Civil War and elevating him to high office. But the conspirators pressured Brutus, leaving anonymous notes on his judicial seat that read, "Brutus, you are asleep. You are not the real Brutus." They naively believed that if Caesar was dead, the old republic would magically wake up from its nightmare. The laws would automatically return, and freedom would be restored. On the morning of the Ides of March, 44 BC, inside the theater of Pompey where the Senate was meeting, the trap snapped shut. Caesar walked into the hall unguarded, ignoring multiple warnings. The conspirators surrounded his chair under the guise of presenting a petition, and one pulled down his toga from his neck, the signal to strike. Then the first knife flashed. Casca struck a blow, grazing Caesar's shoulder. Caesar spun around, defending himself with his iron stylus, crying out, "Vile Casca, what are you doing?" But the rest of the conspirators drew their hidden blades, closing in a frantic circle. They were so blinded by panic that they actually cut each other's hands as they stabbed wildly. 23 times, iron blades pierced Caesar's flesh. He fought back desperately until he saw Brutus holding a bloody dagger. Overwhelmed by the betrayal, Caesar stopped fighting, allegedly muttered his famous last words, "You too, my child," pulled his toga over his face, and collapsed at the base of his old rival Pompey's statue. The conspirators ran into the crowded public squares, waving their bloody daggers and shouting that the tyrant was dead, the Republic was restored, and Rome was free. They expected the crowds to cheer. But here is the tragic twist of history. Killing the dictator did not bring back freedom. It accelerated the collapse into total darkness. The politicians completely misunderstood the reality of their world. The Republic wasn't dying because of Caesar. Caesar was merely a symptom of a system already dead from the inside out. The common people didn't want a corrupt oligarchy disguised as democracy. They loved Caesar because he actually fed them, gave them jobs, and provided real security. When news of the assassination spread, the public fell into a shocked silence that quickly turned into explosive rage. At Caesar's public funeral, Mark Antony delivered an emotionally devastating speech, lifting up Caesar's bloody, torn toga to count the 23 knife wounds. He read Caesar's will aloud, revealing that the dictator had left a massive cash sum to every single citizen of Rome and turned his private gardens into a public park. The crowd erupted. They ripped up the wooden benches of the Forum to build a massive funeral pyre right there in the square and cremate Caesar's body. Then, they grabbed burning brands from the fire and marched through the streets, hunting the conspirators and forcing Brutus and Cassius to flee the city in disguise. By killing the one man stable enough to hold the broken pieces of the state together, the politicians blew up the democracy entirely, plunging the Western world into 15 years of brutal civil war that erased whatever scraps of freedom were left. Out of the smoke emerged a single victor, Octavian, a frail but chillingly brilliant 19-year-old who was the great-nephew and adopted son of Julius Caesar. No one had taken him seriously at first, but Octavian possessed a cold intellect that completely outmatched his rivals. History would remember him by a far more imposing title, Augustus. Augustus pulled off what his adoptive father couldn't. He eliminated every single assassin who held a knife on the Ides of March, forcing Brutus and Cassius into suicide after crushing their armies. He then turned on his own allies, defeating Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. He conquered the unimaginable wealth of Egypt and held the personal loyalty of every single legionary. He was, by every metric of material reality, an absolute monarch with total control over the life, death, law, and treasury of the Western world. But Augustus was a deeper psychologist than Caesar. He looked at his father's bloody toga and learned the ultimate lesson of power. If you walk into Rome wearing a crown, or if you openly mock the traditions of the people, they will kill you. The Roman people absolutely loathed the word king. So Augustus pulled off the most successful political lie in human history. In the year 27 BC, Augustus walked into the Senate and made a meticulously staged theatrical announcement. He declared that the civil wars were over and that he was voluntarily surrendering all of his emergency military and civil powers back to the Senate and the Roman people. He announced the glorious restoration of the traditional Roman Republic. He refused to be called king or dictator. Instead, he told the public that he was simply their princeps, the first citizen. He was just a regular guy, a servant of the state. It was a masterclass in semantic manipulation. Augustus kept all the old democratic machinery running perfectly on the surface. The Senate still met to debate, politicians still wore white togas and ran for annual elections, and the ancient religious ceremonies were strictly observed. The common people saw their institutions intact, so they cheered. They believed they were free. But behind the velvet curtain lay a terrifying reality. Augustus had completely re-engineered the internal anatomy of power while leaving the external skin exactly the same. The Senate couldn't pass a single law without his personal approval. The annual elections were a sham, carefully rigged by his immense personal wealth and lists of approved candidates. Most importantly, every single soldier swore a binding personal oath of loyalty directly to Augustus and his family, not to the state. He controlled the army, the money, and the executive power. He was an emperor disguised as a citizen. Augustus realized a profound truth. If you give people the appearance of freedom, if you let them keep their titles, flags, and democratic catchphrases, they will happily let you control every aspect of their lives behind the scenes. The Roman citizens didn't care that their democratic rights had been hollowed out, because they were simply exhausted from decades of unpredictable civil war. They willingly traded their actual freedom for the comforting illusion of stability, building monuments to him as the father of the country. This grand illusion birthed a legendary golden era known to history as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For nearly 200 years, the Mediterranean world experienced an unprecedented epoch of stability, international trade, and staggering architectural wealth. With a single, undisputed authority controlling the system from the shadows, the bloody civil wars vanished. The borders were secure, and the economy boomed. Rome expanded to its colossal peak size, stretching from the deserts of Iraq to the hills of Scotland, encompassing over 70 million people under one unified law. They built glittering luxury palaces, engineered public baths larger than modern sports stadiums, and constructed massive aqueducts that pumped millions of gallons of fresh water into public fountains and private villas every day. Thousands of miles of paved stone roads allowed exotic silks from China, spices from India, and incense from Arabia to flood into the capital every morning. To any outside observer, it looked like the highest, most magnificent civilization to ever exist. It looked completely permanent. But the Pax Romana was fundamentally a golden cage. The peace was real, but it came at a devastating cost to the human soul, the complete death of public accountability, free speech, and true democracy. Citizens no longer had a single drop of real influence in how their world was governed. Power was concentrated entirely in the dark, whispered corridors of a single palace, subject to the whims of an absolute emperor and his unelected inner circle. The populace stopped caring about politics and foreign affairs. When you remove the voice of the people and replace it with absolute luxury, hyperconsumerism, and centralized control, a society inevitably begins to decay from the inside out. It is a slow, invisible rot. As long as the economy functioned, the food was cheap, and the entertainment in the stadiums was violent, the population simply didn't care that their fundamental rights had been stripped away. They were numbed by wealth, trading their status as active citizens for the status of passive consumers. They didn't want to fight in the army anymore, so the empire had to hire foreign mercenaries to guard the borders. They didn't want to work the fields, so they relied entirely on slave labor and foreign grain shipments. Beneath the gleaming marble facades of the Pax Romana, the foundations were already cracking. Concentrated wealth and absolute power were making the leadership increasingly unhinged and detached from reality. The citizenry was becoming completely passive, turning away from civic duty and transforming into a population that only cared about immediate, personal comfort. The stage was officially set for the final act of the tragedy. The rot was moving from the bones to the skin. Leadership was about to devolve into madness, and the ultimate distraction mechanism was about to take over. In part 3 of our series, we are exploring the terrifying reality of bread and circuses, how the later emperors used state-subsidized cheap food and hyper-violent stadium bloodsports to keep a failing, distracted population completely blind to their own impending doom while the borders burned. Make sure you are subscribed to the channel right now. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the exact second part 3 drops, and open up the description box down below to access the full playlist link. Before you go, leave a comment below letting me know your thoughts. Do you think Augustus was a brilliant savior who rescued Rome from self-destruction? Or was he history's most dangerous dictator? I'll be down in the comments replying to everyone in the first hour. Click that playlist link in the description, stay in the loop, and I'll see you in the next part.